The banging on the door came before dawn, hard and fast, 3 heavy knocks that shook the thin wood and rattled the cups on the shelf. Elira sat up on her cot, heart hammering, and reached instinctively for the shawl that covered her back even in sleep. Outside, she heard boots on gravel, more than one pair, moving with purpose. "Open in the name of the crown," a voice called. Odessa, the old healer who had raised Elira since she was found wrapped in a scorched blanket at the edge of the forest 18 years earlier, moved faster than her age should have allowed. She pressed a finger to her lips and pointed Elira toward the back room, the one with the loose floorboard and the crawl space beneath it that had never once been used until this very moment. "Go," Odessa whispered. "Now." Elira did not argue. She had learned long ago that when Odessa's voice dropped to that flat, urgent tone, there was no time for questions. She slid beneath the floor as the front door groaned open above her, and she pressed her palm against the cold earth to keep herself still, to keep herself silent, while her whole body wanted to shake. Through the gap in the boards, she could see boots, polished and dark, the kind worn by soldiers who served in a royal house rather than a border patrol. A man's voice, clipped and businesslike, asked Odessa about supplies of feverwort, and asked whether she had seen any travelers passing through in recent nights, strangers without papers. Odessa answered plainly, her voice steady, offering tea, offering nothing that mattered. It was a routine inspection, nothing more. The soldiers were sweeping the border villages for smugglers, who had been moving stolen grain across the old Ashwood line, a stretch of forest that had been empty and forbidden for as long as anyone could remember. They left within the quarter hour, and Elira climbed out from beneath the floor with dust in her hair and her pulse still racing. "That was close," she said. Odessa did not answer right away. She sat down at the small table, folded her hands, and looked at Elira with an expression that was somehow both tender and afraid, an expression Elira had seen more and more often in the past few months, ever since Odessa's cough had turned wet and would not leave. "One day," Odessa said quietly, "it will not be soldiers looking for grain smugglers. It will be soldiers looking for you." Elira laughed, though it came out thin. "Why would anyone look for me? I sew hems and mend cloaks. I am nobody." "You are not nobody," Odessa said. "You have never been nobody. You only think you are because I have spent your whole life making sure no one looked at you closely enough to see otherwise." Elira did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and the morning slipped forward the way mornings always did in the border village of Merofen, with chores and customers and the low murmur of gossip drifting through the market square. She worked at her small shop through the daylight hours, fingers quick with needle and thread, taking in a coat for the miller's wife, and letting out a dress for a girl who had grown taller than her mother expected. It was easy, in the business of ordinary things, to forget the knock on the door. It was easy to forget the tightness in Odessa's face. But that evening, when Elira returned home and found Odessa slumped in her chair, breathing shallow and fast, the fear came rushing back tenfold. "I am fine," Odessa insisted, waving away Elira's hands. "Only tired." She was not fine. Elira could see that plainly, the gray tint to her lips, the way her fingers trembled when she tried to lift her cup. Elira had grown up around sickness and healing both, had learned the names of 100 herbs before she had learned to read, and she knew, with the sinking certainty of someone who has watched death approach slowly and quietly, that Odessa's time was running short. "Tell me what is happening," Elira said, kneeling by the chair, taking Odessa's cold hands in her own. "Please, whatever it is you have been hiding from me, tell me now, while you still can." Odessa was quiet for a long moment, staring at the low fire in the hearth, as though she could see the past burning within it. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed, had grown older and heavier, as though she had set down a weight she had carried for nearly 2 decades. "You were not born to me," she said. "You know this already, but you do not know all of it. 18 years ago, on the worst night of my life, a woman came to my door, carrying an infant, wrapped in a scorched blanket. She was running, Elira, running from soldiers, from fire, from a night that swallowed an entire pack whole. She begged me to take the child and disappear into the border villages where no one from the capital would think to look. Then she went back the way she came, back toward the flames, and I never saw her again." Elira's chest felt tight, as though the air in the small cottage had thinned. "What pack? What fire?" "The Ashwood pack," Odessa said, and even now, all these years later, she lowered her voice, as though the walls themselves might carry the name back to the crown. You will not have heard it spoken aloud in your life, because the king who rules now made certain the word was struck from every record, every song, every memory that could be reached. The official story is that the Ashwood pack betrayed the kingdom and was banished for it, driven from their lands in a single terrible night, but I have never believed that story, not since I held you as a baby and saw what your mother had done to protect you. What do you mean? Odessa reached forward and gently turned Illyra around, tugging the collar of her dress down just enough to expose the top of her spine, where dark lines of ink curled and knotted beneath her skin. Illyra had always known the marks were there. She had grown up believing they were simply an old healing charm, something Odessa had done to protect her from illness as an infant, the kind of small folk magic that border villages still practiced quietly despite the crown's disapproval. This is not a charm, Odessa said. I never touched a needle to your skin, Illyra. You came to me already marked, already carrying this. Your mother did this to you, the night the fire came. I do not know how, or when, or with what ink, but I believe with everything I have left in me, that these marks are not decoration, they are memory, names, written into your very body, so that if the pack itself was destroyed, something of it would survive. Illyra's hand went to her own back, fingers brushing the marks she could not see, tracing the shapes she had felt beneath her fingertips 1,000 times without ever understanding them. Whose names? I do not know all of them, Odessa admitted. I was afraid to look too closely. Afraid that knowing too much would put you in more danger than you were already in. But I know this much. If the crown ever learns what you carry, they will not see a healing charm. They will see the last living record of a pack they tried to erase from history, and they will not let that record continue to breathe. The fire popped and settled, and for a long while neither of them spoke. Illyra sat with the truth settling over her like a heavy blanket, trying to reconcile the quiet, small life she had always known with the story Odessa had just placed into her hands. She thought of the soldiers that morning, of their polished boots and their questions about strangers without papers, and she understood for the first time that danger had always been closer to her than she realized, simply waiting, patient, for the day it would recognize her. Why tell me now? She asked finally. Odessa's smile was sad and small. Because I am dying, child, and I will not lie to you about that any longer. My cough is not a passing illness. I have felt it settling into my chest for months, and no herb I know will pull it free. Before I go, I wanted you to have the truth, even an incomplete one, rather than leave you alone in the world carrying a secret you did not understand. Illyra wanted to argue, wanted to insist that Odessa was wrong, that there was some remedy they had not tried, some healer further north who might know a cure, but she had spent enough years at Odessa's side to recognize the particular stillness of someone who has made peace with an ending, and arguing against it felt like a cruelty rather than a kindness. What do I do? Illyra asked instead. If the marks are dangerous, if the crown would hurt me for carrying them, what am I supposed to do with that? Hide forever? Pretend I never learned any of this? I cannot tell you that, Odessa said. I have hidden you for 18 years, because it was the only thing I knew how to do, and I do not regret it, because it kept you alive. But you are not a child any longer, and this is not a decision I have the right to make for you. All I can tell you is what I believe, and I believe those names on your back were never meant to stay silent forever. Whatever your mother intended when she marked you, I do not think it was for you to carry them to your grave without anyone ever knowing they existed. That night, after Odessa had finally fallen into an exhausted, rattling sleep, Illyra sat alone by the dying fire and turned the day over and over in her mind. She thought of the small, quiet life she had built for herself in Marrowfen, the customers who trusted her with their mending, the girl at the bakery who waved to her every morning, the comfortable, unremarkable rhythm of days that asked nothing more of her than steady hands and a patient ear. She thought of how easily all of it could be taken from her, how a single knock on the door, a single soldier's curious glance at her collar, could unravel everything she had ever known. But beneath the fear, something else stirred, something she did not entirely recognize. A pull, faint but insistent, toward the truth Odessa had given her, toward the names she could not read and the mother she would never meet, toward a history that had been stolen not only from her, but from an entire pack that the kingdom had decided should never have existed at all. She did not know yet what she would do with that pull. She did not know that within the month, Odessa would be gone, and grief would push her toward a decision she had not been ready to make. She did not know that the road leading away from Marrowfin would take her not toward safety, but directly into the shadow of the very throne that had ordered her people destroyed. All she knew, sitting alone in the dark with her hand pressed against the marks on her own spine, was that the life she had always believed was hers had never truly been the whole of her story, and that somewhere out there, whether she sought it or not, the rest of that story was waiting to find her. The next morning came gray and damp, and Alira moved through her chores with a distracted slowness, her mind circling back again and again to Odessa's words. She opened her small shop as usual, laid out her spools of thread, and tried to focus on the coat a farmer had brought in for repair, but her hands kept pausing mid-stitch, her thoughts drifting to fire and names and a mother she had never known. It was near midday when a traveler stepped into her shop, a stranger with a dusty cloak and the look of someone who had walked a long way without much rest. He asked, almost casually, whether the village still remembered the old stories of the forest to the north, the stretch of land the maps simply marked as forbidden. Alira kept her eyes on her needle. I know only that no one goes there. The soldiers say it is unsafe, old ground, unstable, since a fire years ago. The traveler smiled, though there was little warmth in it. A fire, yes, that is one word for it. My grandmother used to say, there was once a whole pack living in those woods, proud people with their own laws and their own songs, until the crown decided their land was worth more than their lives. She said the fire that took them was not an accident of nature. She said soldiers carried the torches themselves. Alira's needle stilled completely now, though she forced her face to remain calm. That sounds like a story for frightening children. Or perhaps it is simply a story the crown would rather no one tell out loud. He set a few coins on her counter for a small repair to his cloak, thanked her, and left as quietly as he had come, leaving Alira staring after him, with her heart beating strangely fast. She told herself it meant nothing, that travelers passing through border villages often carried wild tales meant to unsettle the locals, tales traded for the price of a warm meal or a curious audience. But the timing of it, arriving so soon after Odessa's confession, felt less like coincidence and more like the world quietly confirming a truth she had only just learned to fear. That evening, she found Odessa sitting up in bed, stronger than she had seemed the night before, insisting on being helped to the table so they might share a proper supper together. Alira did not mention the traveler. She did not want to burden Odessa further, not when the older woman's strength seemed to come and go like a candle flickering in a draft. Instead, she asked the question that had been pressing at her all day. If my mother meant for these names to be found one day, why hide them at all? Why not simply tell someone, write it down somewhere safer than my own skin? Odessa considered this for a long moment before answering. Because paper burns, child, and records can be seized and destroyed by anyone with enough soldiers and enough will. But a living person carries their history with them wherever they go, and short of ending that life entirely, there is no way to erase what is written into skin and blood. I believe your mother knew the pack itself might not survive that night. I believe she made certain that even if everything else was taken, one small piece of them would keep breathing, keep walking, keep existing in the world whether the crown liked it or not. That sounds like a terrible weight to give a child, Alira said quietly. It is, Odessa agreed. And I am sorry for it, more sorry than I have ever told you. I have spent every year since trying to make certain that weight never had to be lifted, that you could live a full life without ever needing to know what you carried. I failed at that, in the end, because my body is failing, and I could not let you face what comes next, without at least understanding why. Alira reached across the table and took Odessa's hand, feeling how thin and cool it had become, how different from the strong, capable hands she remembered from her childhood, hands that had once carried heavy baskets of herbs down from the hills without tiring. You did not fail, she said. You gave me 18 years I would not have had otherwise. Whatever comes next, I am grateful for that, more than I know how to say. They sat together a while longer, speaking of smaller things, the price of wool at the market, a neighbor's new litter of pups, the ordinary texture of a life that Alira suddenly understood she might not get to keep for very much longer. When Odessa finally grew tired and asked to be helped back to bed, Alira tucked the blankets around her, with the same careful attention Odessa had once shown her as a child, and she sat by the bedside long after the older woman's breathing had evened into sleep. Outside, The wind moved through the trees at the edge of the village, carrying with it the faint, cold scent of the forest to the north, the forbidden ground where fire had once taken more than land. Elira listened to it for a long time, feeling, for the first time in her life, as though that distant forest was somehow listening back. Shouting broke out in the market square just as Elira was closing her shutters for the evening, sharp voices rising over the clatter of overturned crates. She stepped outside to see two merchants locked in an argument that had already drawn a small crowd, one accusing the other of smuggling grain across the old border line and pocketing coin meant for the crown's tax collectors. Before either man could throw a punch, the sound of hooves on the packed dirt road cut through the noise, and the crowd fell silent almost instantly. A column of riders entered the square, cloaks the deep green of the royal house, banners snapping in the evening wind. At their head rode a man who needed no introduction, though Elira had never seen him this close before. Cale Thornhale, the Alpha King, sat tall in his saddle, with an ease that suggested command was as natural to him as breathing. His presence alone seemed to still the entire square, merchants bowing their heads, children being pulled quickly out of the road. He had come, it turned out, because word of the grain smuggling had reached the capital, and disputes along the border were beginning to strain trade routes he needed functioning smoothly. He dismounted with the same unhurried confidence, listened to both merchants for exactly as long as it took to understand the shape of their quarrel, and settled the matter with a single decision that satisfied no one completely, and yet ended the argument outright. It was, Elira thought, watching from the edge of the crowd, an oddly efficient kind of fairness. She might have slipped away unnoticed, as she always did in gatherings like this, if her shawl had not caught on the edge of a market stall as she turned to leave. It pulled loose from her shoulder just enough to expose the top edge of the ink along her collarbone, before she could yank it back into place. It was a small thing, a fraction of a second, and she thought nothing of it, until she felt eyes on her, and turned to find the king watching her directly. He did not approach right away. He finished his business with the merchants first, gave instructions to one of his riders about a formal patrol to be stationed near the border for the coming month, and only then did he make his way through the thinning crowd toward the small seamstress shop where Elira had already retreated behind her counter, heart beating faster than she wanted it to. "You mend cloaks here," he said, more observation than question, glancing at the bolts of fabric stacked along her shelves. "I do," Elira answered, keeping her voice steady. "Cloaks, coats, hems, whatever needs a needle." He studied her for a moment longer than the conversation required, his gaze drifting briefly to her collar, before returning to her face. "I noticed a mark near your shoulder, an unusual design for a border village." Elira's pulse spiked, but she had spent years learning to keep her expression calm, even when her thoughts raced. "An old family charm," she said, "meant to ward off illness. My mother believed in such things." "Your mother," he repeated, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. "Is she here in the village?" "She passed some time ago," Elira lied smoothly, though the words tasted strange, since Odessa was very much alive, resting at home even now. She did not know why she chose to protect the truth so instinctively, in front of this stranger, only that every instinct she owned told her to give away as little as possible. He seemed for a moment as though he might press further, but instead he simply nodded once and turned to survey the shop, his attention shifting to the mundane details of thread and cloth, as though searching for something ordinary to anchor himself back into the conversation. It was strange, Elira thought, watching him. There had been something almost startled in his expression when he first noticed her mark, a reaction that seemed too large for something as small as an old charm glimpsed by accident. What she could not have known, standing behind her counter with her heart still hammering, was that Cale's wolf had reacted the moment her scent reached him properly, a recognition his mind refused to accept even as something older and more instinctive within him sat up sharply and paid attention. It was not simple attraction, though that was there too, quiet and unbidden. It was something closer to memory, as though some part of him recognized her the way one recognizes a name heard once in childhood and never quite forgotten. He left the shop without further explanation, mounted his horse, and rode with his column toward the small inn, where he would stay the night, before returning to the capital in the morning. Elira closed her shutters properly this time, latched the door, and stood very still in the middle of her shop for a long while, trying to steady her breathing. When she returned home, Odessa was waiting at the table, alert despite her illness, having heard from a neighbor that the king himself had ridden through the square. "Did he see you?" she asked immediately. No greeting, straight to the fear that mattered most. "He saw my collar," Elira admitted. "Only for a moment. I told him it was a charm my mother left me." Odessa closed her eyes briefly, exhaling something between relief and dread. That was quick thinking. "But Elira, listen to me carefully. If the king himself noticed the mark, even briefly, he will not simply forget it. Men like him do not survive on thrones by ignoring small oddities. You must be more careful than you have ever been." "I know," Elira said, though even as she said it, she found herself replaying the strange stillness in his expression, the way his gaze had lingered a heartbeat longer than casual curiosity should have allowed. She did not mention that part to Odessa. She was not entirely certain what it meant herself. That night, at the inn, Cale sat awake long after his men had settled into their rooms, staring at the small fire in his hearth without truly seeing it. His advisor, a steady, careful man named Edwin Locke, who had served the royal house since Cale's father's time, found him there and asked, with the familiarity of long service, what troubled him. "A woman in the village," Cale said finally, "a seamstress. She had a mark on her skin, ink of some kind, arranged in a pattern I have never seen before. My wolf reacted to it strangely." Edwin frowned, setting down the papers he had been carrying. "Reacted how?" "As though it recognized something," Cale admitted, sounding almost frustrated with himself for the admission. "I do not understand it. I have never met the woman in my life, and yet, something in me responded to her, as though I had been waiting for her without knowing it." Edwin was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully, the way he always did, when a subject bordered on matters best left undisturbed. "There are old rites," he said eventually, "alliance bonds, recognized by instinct rather than ceremony, that some pacts once used to bind their bloodlines together across generations. I have not heard such things spoken of seriously in years. Most consider them legend. And if they are not legend, then I would suggest, my king, that whatever your wolf recognized in that village was not chosen at random." Edwin's expression grew careful, guarded in a way that made Cale study him more closely. "Might I ask what the mark looked like?" Cale tried to recall it precisely, the lines curling from her collarbone in a pattern that had seemed, in the brief moment he glimpsed it, almost like the branching structure of a family tree, rendered in ink rather than parchment. He described it as best he could, and watched as something shifted behind Edwin's eyes, a flicker of memory quickly suppressed. "It is likely nothing," Edwin said, too quickly. "A local custom, as she told you. Border villages keep old superstitions long after the capital forgets them." But Cale, who had built a rein on reading the small hesitations of men far more practiced at hiding their thoughts than his advisor, noticed the pause before Edwin spoke, the careful flatness of his tone. He did not press the matter that night, but he did not forget it either. Before his column departed the following morning, he gave quiet instructions to one of his most trusted riders to remain behind in Marrowfen, to watch the seamstress from a discreet distance and report anything unusual, though he told himself this was simple caution, a king's ordinary vigilance, nothing more. He rode back toward the capital, with the image of her still lingering at the edges of his thoughts, the steady calm in her voice when she lied to him about her mother, the flash of something fierce and guarded behind her eyes when he asked about the mark. He did not yet understand why a border seamstress had unsettled him more thoroughly than any noble conspiracy or trade dispute had managed in years, but he understood enough to know that this was not a matter he intended to let rest. Behind him, in the small village of Marrowfen, Elira sat by Odessa's bedside long after dark, turning the day's events over in her mind, unable to shake the feeling that something had shifted irreversibly the moment the king's eyes met hers across a crowded square. The following days passed with a strange, watchful quality that Elira could not quite explain until she noticed the same young rider lingering near the market on 3 separate mornings, always at a distance, always with a reason, ready if anyone asked why he remained in the village after his king's column had departed. His name, she learned from the innkeeper's daughter, was Garrett, and he claimed to be waiting on further orders before rejoining the capital patrol. Elira did not believe that story for a moment. She had grown up reading the small tales of people trying too hard to appear unremarkable, and Garrett watched her shop with the particular attention of someone assigned a task rather than someone simply passing time. She said nothing to him directly, choosing instead to behave exactly as she always had, opening her shutters at the same hour, greeting customers with the same warmth, giving him nothing unusual to report. It was Odessa who finally addressed it, on the fourth evening, when Alira mentioned the writer's presence almost as an afterthought while helping her into bed. "He is watching you," Odessa said immediately, her voice sharpening despite her weakness. "Not the village. You." "I know," Alira admitted. "I have been careful. I have kept the shawl high, kept my answers simple." "Careful is good," Odessa said, "but careful will not last forever if the king himself has decided you are worth watching. Men do not send soldiers to linger in quiet villages without reason, Alira. Whatever he felt when he saw your mark, it was strong enough to make him curious, and curiosity in a king is far more dangerous than curiosity in an ordinary man." Alira sat at the edge of the bed, turning the problem over in her mind. "What would you have me do? Run? Where would I even go that a king's soldiers could not eventually find me?" Odessa did not answer right away, and when she finally spoke, her voice had softened into something more contemplative. "I do not know if running is wise any longer. Perhaps it never truly was, only the least frightening option available to a frightened woman holding an infant 18 years ago. Perhaps the better question is not how to hide from this, but how to survive it if it finds you regardless." The words settled uneasily in Alira's chest as she walked home through the dark that night, aware, though she did not turn to check, that Garrett's shadow likely still lingered somewhere near the square. She thought of the king's face when he had asked about her mother, the flicker of something unreadable behind his composed expression, and she wondered, not for the first time, what exactly his wolf had recognized in her that had unsettled him enough to leave a man behind to watch. She did not yet understand the old rites Edwin had mentioned to Cale in the privacy of the inn, did not know that some deep, instinctive part of a wolf could recognize a bloodline bond before the mind attached any reason to the feeling. All she knew was that something had shifted the moment their eyes met across the square, some quiet recognition she could not name, but could not dismiss either, and that whatever it meant, it had already begun pulling the threads of her carefully hidden life loose, one small thread at a time. A choking cough tore Alira from sleep in the middle of the night, sharp and desperate, coming from the next room. She was on her feet before she was fully awake, stumbling through the dark to find Odessa doubled over on the edge of her bed, one hand pressed against her chest, struggling to draw breath that did not seem to want to come. "Odessa," Alira gasped, catching her before she could slide to the floor. "Odessa, stay with me. I have you." The older woman's lips had taken on a bluish tint in the dim candlelight, and her breath rattled wetly with each attempt, each one shorter than the last. Alira's training rose to the surface even through her panic, and she propped Odessa upright, cleared the small space around her, called out into the night for the neighbor's boy to run for the village's other healer, a younger woman named Marigold who had trained under Odessa herself years earlier. It felt like an eternity before Marigold arrived, though it could only have been minutes, and by then, Odessa's breathing had steadied slightly, though it remained shallow and strained. Marigold examined her quickly, her expression grave in a way she tried and failed to hide from Alira. "Her lungs are filling," Marigold said quietly, once Odessa had drifted into an exhausted, restless sleep. "I can ease her breathing for a time, keep her comfortable, but I cannot reverse what has already taken root. I am sorry, Alira. I do not think there is much time left." Alira nodded, though the words landed like stones in her chest, heavy and final, despite the fact that some part of her had known this was coming for weeks. She sat by Odessa's bedside for the remainder of the night, holding her hand, listening to each breath, as though counting them might somehow slow their passing. Odessa lingered for 3 more days, drifting between sleep and brief moments of clarity, and in one of those clearer moments, she gripped Alira's hand with surprising strength and pulled her close. "Listen to me," she whispered. "There is a locked chest beneath the floor of the back room, hidden deeper than the space you have hidden in before. Inside it, you will find the blanket your mother wrapped you in, and a letter I never had the courage to give you while I still had the chance to change my mind about it. Do not open it until I am gone. Promise me." "I promise," Alira said, tears slipping freely down her face now, no longer held back by the need to appear strong. "You are stronger than you know," Odessa continued, her voice growing fainter. "Whatever you decide to do with what you carry, Do not let fear be the only thing that decides it for you. I hid you out of love, but love and fear can look very alike from the inside. And I would not have you make the same choice I made, simply because it is familiar. Odessa passed 2 nights later, quietly, in her sleep, with Alira's hand still held in her own. The village gathered for a small, humble funeral, and for days afterward, Alira moved through her shop and her cottage, like someone wading through deep water, every motion slower and heavier than it should have been. Grief settled into her the way winter settles into old stone, patient and thorough, and she found herself, more than once, simply standing in the middle of a room having forgotten entirely what she had walked in to do. It was nearly 2 weeks before she found the strength to open the chest Odessa had told her about. Inside, exactly as promised, lay a folded blanket, scorched at one edge, soft with age, and a sealed letter, written in handwriting she did not recognize but somehow, absurdly, felt familiar. Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal. The letter was brief, written by Odessa herself rather than by Alira's birth mother, explaining as plainly as she could the little she had actually witnessed that terrible night, 18 years ago. She wrote of a woman arriving at her door just before dawn, her clothing scorched, her eyes wild with a grief too large to contain, pressing an infant into Odessa's arms, and speaking only a handful of words before disappearing back into the smoke. The woman had said only one thing that Odessa remembered clearly enough to record. Keep her safe until the names can breathe again. Alira read the words over and over, feeling their weight settle into the same place in her chest, where Odessa's absence now lived. Keep her safe until the names can breathe again. It was not the language of a woman abandoning her child out of necessity alone. It was the language of someone leaving behind a purpose, a task unfinished, entrusted to a stranger, because there was no one else left to entrust it to. She sat with the letter and the scorched blanket for the remainder of the evening, turning Odessa's final words over in her mind, alongside her mother's. Do not let fear be the only thing that decides it for you. Keep her safe until the names can breathe again. 2 women she had barely known, in different ways, both asking the same quiet question of her without ever meeting each other. What will you do with what has been given to you? The following morning, she made her decision, though it took her the better part of the day to admit it fully to herself. She could not continue living quietly in Marrowfen, mending cloaks and pretending the marks on her spine were nothing more than an old family charm, not now that she understood, even partially, what they truly represented. She did not yet know what she intended to do with the truth, whether she sought justice, or simply answers, or something she could not yet name. But she knew she could not remain still any longer. She spent the following week settling her small affairs, selling what furniture she could not carry, giving her remaining fabric and tools to Marigold in gratitude for her care of Odessa, and preparing herself for a journey she had never imagined taking. When word reached the village that the royal household in the capital was seeking skilled seamstresses to join its staff ahead of an upcoming season of court gatherings, Alira felt something settle into place, as though the path forward had been quietly waiting for her to notice it. She told herself it was simple practicality, a reasonable way to support herself in a new city, while she considered her next steps. She did not allow herself to examine too closely the deeper pull she felt toward the capital, toward the throne that had ordered her people destroyed, toward the strange, unsettling recognition she had seen in the king's eyes the single time their paths had crossed. She packed the scorched blanket and Odessa's letter carefully into her single travel bag, along with her sewing tools and what little coin she had saved, and on a cool morning, with fog still clinging to the low fields outside Marrowfen, she set out on the long road toward the capital. The journey took the better part of a week, passing through villages larger than her own, past farmland and forest, and eventually the wide, paved roads that led toward the capital's gates. She spoke to few travelers along the way, kept her collar high out of habit rather than immediate fear, and used the long hours of walking to prepare herself mentally for whatever waited ahead. She thought often of Odessa's final words, of the courage it must have taken her mother to hand over her only child to a stranger, rather than risk carrying her into whatever violence awaited that night. She thought of the names inked into her spine, still unread, still unknown to her in their specifics, waiting patiently beneath her skin, the way they had waited for 18 years already. And she thought, more than she wanted to admit, of the king's face, the strange stillness that had crossed it when his gaze first found the edge of her mark. On the 4th day of her journey, while resting beside a stream to refill her water skin, Alira noticed an old woman sitting nearby, on a flat stone, watching her, with an unusual intensity that made the hair on Alira's arms rise. The woman was thin, weathered by years of travel, and carried a walking stick, carved with small symbols Alira did not recognize at first glance, though something about their shape tugged uncomfortably at her memory. "You walk toward the capital," the woman said, not quite a question. "I do," Alira answered carefully, keeping her distance, seeking work. The old woman's eyes drifted, briefly but unmistakably, toward Alira's collar, where the edge of her mark peeked out despite her best efforts to keep it covered. "There are not many left who still carry the old ink," she said quietly. "I had thought, after all these years, that the ones who did had either learned to hide it perfectly, or had not survived long enough to need to." Alira's breath caught. "What do you know of it?" "Only fragments," the woman admitted. "I lost family the same night the fire came, though I was grown already married into another territory, and so I was spared what those still living in Ashwood lands were not. I have spent years since listening for word of survivors, though I confess, I stopped truly expecting to find any some time ago." She studied Alira a moment longer, something like cautious hope flickering behind her tired eyes. "May I ask your name, child?" "Alira." The name seemed to mean nothing to the woman, and something in her expression fell slightly, though she recovered quickly. "It matters little whether the name matches what I remember. What matters is that you exist, and that you walk toward the very place that tried to ensure none of you would. Be careful there, Alira. The capital remembers little of what it destroyed, but it remembers enough to grow uneasy if reminded too directly." She offered no further explanation, no name of her own, and by the time Alira had finished refilling her water skin and turned to ask more questions, the woman had already risen and continued down the road in the opposite direction, moving with surprising speed for someone so apparently frail. Alira stood alone by the stream for a long while afterward, turning the brief exchange over in her mind, wondering how many others like this woman existed scattered across the kingdom, carrying fragments of a history that no official record acknowledged. The encounter unsettled her more than she expected, not because of any threat it carried, but because of how easily the old woman had recognized her mark for what it truly was, confirming in the space of a few sentences everything Odessa had only been able to guess at. If a stranger on a quiet road could see the truth so plainly, Alira understood with sudden clarity that hiding it forever, even in a city as large and distracted as the capital, would require more caution than she had perhaps allowed herself to believe. She resumed her journey with a heavier awareness settling over her shoulders, checking more frequently now for eyes that lingered too long, for questions that circled too close to the truth. By the time the capital's towering gates came into view, rising pale and imposing against the gray morning sky, Alira had made peace with one simple truth. She was no longer simply the seamstress from Merofen, hiding quietly at the edge of the kingdom. Whatever waited for her within those walls, whatever answers or dangers the capital held, she intended to walk toward them with open eyes, rather than continue living in the shadow of a past she did not fully understand. The road behind her led back to a small, safe life she could never fully return to. The road ahead led directly into the heart of the throne that had tried, 18 years earlier, to erase the very history she now carried. A guard's gauntleted hand shot out and blocked Alira's path the moment she reached the capital's gate, his voice sharp with suspicion. "Papers," he demanded, eyeing her travel-worn cloak and the single bag slung across her shoulder. "Where are you from, and what business brings you to the capital?" Alira kept her voice steady, despite the sudden hammering of her heart. "Merofen, at the border. I have come seeking work with the royal household. I was told seamstresses were needed ahead of the season's court gatherings." The guard studied her a long moment, clearly unconvinced, and called over a second man who carried a ledger and a look of practiced boredom. Together they questioned her about her village, her trade, whether she had family who could vouch for her, and Alira answered each question with careful, simple truths, offering nothing more than what was asked, revealing nothing that might invite further scrutiny. Eventually, satisfied that she posed no obvious threat, they waved her through with a warning that any household staff caught lying about their origins would be dismissed without pay, and turned out into the street. She passed through the gate with her pulse still racing, and the sight that greeted her on the other side stole whatever breath she had left. The capital sprawled before her in a way Merofen had never prepared her for. Wide stone avenues crowded with merchants and nobles alike, towering buildings stacked close together, and rising above all of it, the pale spires of Thornhail Castle itself, catching the morning light like something carved from bone. She found her way to the servants' entrance of the castle grounds by asking directions from a baker's assistant who seemed used to travelers arriving lost and overwhelmed. There, she joined a small line of other hopeful applicants, mostly women, some clearly skilled seamstresses like herself, others simply desperate for steady work, and willing to claim whatever trade might grant them entry. The woman conducting interviews, a sharp-eyed household steward named Miriam Voss, coincidentally sharing part of Elira's own surname, though no relation existed between them, examined Elira's stitching on a sample scrap of fabric with a critical eye, before nodding, apparently satisfied. "Your work is finer than most who come through this line," Miriam said. "Where did you train?" "My mother," Elira answered, the lie coming easily now after weeks of practice. "She kept a shop at the border. I have sewn since I was old enough to hold a needle steady." Miriam studied her a moment longer, something faintly curious in her expression, though whether it concerned Elira's skill or something else entirely, Elira could not tell. "Very well. You will begin in the general household pool, mending linens and court garments as needed. Prove yourself capable, and you may be considered for more particular assignments as they arise." Elira thanked her and was shown, along with several other new hires, to the servants' quarters, tucked into the castle's lower levels. Small shared rooms, far removed from the grandeur she had glimpsed in the courtyard above. It was cramped and plain, but it was safe, or as safe as anywhere in this city could be for someone carrying what she carried, and she settled her few belongings with a strange, quiet relief at having somewhere to rest at last. The work itself proved manageable enough in the days that followed. Long hours spent mending torn hems and replacing missing buttons on garments far finer than anything she had handled in Marrowfen, silk and velvet requiring a gentler hand than the rough wool she was accustomed to. She kept to herself among the other staff, polite but reserved, careful always to keep her collar high and her sleeves long, despite the growing warmth of the season. It was on her 5th day in the castle that everything changed. She had been sent to deliver a repaired doublet to one of the upper chambers, a task usually assigned to more senior staff but given to her that day due to a shortage of hands, when she rounded a corner and nearly collided directly with the king himself. Cale stopped short, steadying her with a hand at her elbow, before she could stumble, and the moment his eyes settled on her face, recognition flickered plainly across his features. "You," he said, before he could stop himself. "The seamstress from Marrowfen." Elira's stomach dropped, though she forced herself to remain composed, dropping into a proper curtsy, despite the doublet still folded over her arm. "Your Majesty, I did not expect to encounter you so directly." "Nor did I expect to find you here," he admitted, recovering his own composure quickly, though something in his expression suggested he was working harder than usual to appear unaffected. "You have taken a position in the household." "I have, Your Majesty. My circumstances changed at home, and I required steady work." He studied her a long moment, and Elira could see, even without understanding its cause, that something in him was working through a decision, weighing options she could not guess at. Finally, he spoke, his tone carefully neutral. "I have need of additional staff assigned directly to my personal quarters, given the upcoming season of court gatherings. Miriam Voss will be informed that you are to be reassigned." "Your Majesty, I am grateful for the consideration, but I do not wish to presume upon any special favor." "It is not favor," he said, a touch too quickly, and something flickered across his face that might have been embarrassment had a king allowed himself such a thing. "It is practical necessity. You have proven skill, and I require reliable hands nearby for the season's demands, nothing more." Elira did not believe that explanation entirely, could not quite shake the memory of his reaction to her mark weeks earlier in Marrowfen. But she also understood that arguing with a king's decision, particularly one delivered with such careful finality, was neither wise nor likely to succeed. She curtsied again and accepted the reassignment, watching him continue down the corridor with a strange mixture of unease and something else she did not yet have a name for. Miriam, when informed of the reassignment later that same day, raised an eyebrow but said nothing, beyond confirming the details, moving Elira's few belongings to a smaller room, closer to the royal wing, one shared with only a single other maid, rather than the crowded quarters below. The other staff noticed the change too, whispered speculation, following Alira through the corridors for days afterward, though she did her best to ignore it, focusing instead on the increased demands of her new position. Working in proximity to the king's personal quarters meant longer hours and closer scrutiny, but it also meant, uncomfortably, more frequent encounters with Kale himself, brief exchanges in hallways, quiet nods across dining halls, moments that should have meant nothing but somehow lingered in her thoughts longer than she wanted to admit. She told herself it was simply the strangeness of proximity to power, the natural unease of an ordinary woman, suddenly working within arm's reach of a throne. She did not allow herself to examine too closely why her pulse quickened slightly each time their paths crossed, why she found herself, against her better judgment, curious about the quiet weight he seemed to carry beneath his composed exterior. For his part, Kale found himself equally unsettled by her continued presence, though he told himself, much as she did, that his decision to bring her closer had been purely practical. He caught himself, more than once, glancing toward the seamstress's quarters when he had no genuine reason to, finding excuses to walk corridors he rarely used, and each time he noticed the pattern, he pushed the awareness away with the same stubborn refusal he applied to any distraction from his duties. It was Edwin who finally addressed it directly, some 2 weeks into Alira's new assignment, finding Kale alone in his study late one evening, staring at reports he had clearly not been reading. "You have reassigned the seamstress from Marrowfen to your personal staff," Edwin said, not quite a question. "I required additional hands for the season," Kale replied, though even to his own ears, the explanation sounded thin after so many repetitions. Edwin studied him with the patient, knowing expression of a man who had served long enough to recognize when his king was lying to himself more than to anyone else. "My king, I would be remiss in my duties if I did not raise a concern. If this woman is connected in any way to what we discussed regarding old alliance rights, bringing her closer rather than investigating from a careful distance may not be the wisest course. Should the connection prove real, and should certain parties within the council learn of it, before you fully understand what you are dealing with, the consequences could prove complicated." "I am aware of the risk," Kale said, more sharply than he intended, then softened, rubbing a hand across his tired eyes. "I do not fully understand why I feel compelled to keep her near, Edwin. I only know that some instinct in me insists it is necessary, and I have learned, across years of ruling, not to dismiss such instincts without cause." Edwin said nothing further that night, though his expression remained troubled as he took his leave, and Kale sat alone afterward, with the same unanswered question circling his thoughts, the same quiet, insistent pull he could not name but could no longer ignore. Somewhere below him, in the smaller rooms reserved for personal staff, Alira lay awake as well, staring at the ceiling of her new quarters, feeling, without knowing why, that the walls of Thornhill Castle had begun closing in, around a truth that neither of them was yet prepared to face. 3 nights later, Alira was called upon to assist with preparations for a formal dinner hosted for a visiting delegation from a neighboring territory, a task that required her to remain in the Great Hall itself rather than the workrooms below, adjusting hems and repairing small tears in the garments of nobles who barely acknowledged her presence as she knelt to fix a loose seam or replace a missing clasp. It was tedious, careful work, made more difficult by the crowded noise of the hall and the constant risk of being trodden upon by passing servants carrying heavy trays. She was kneeling near the base of a pillar, adjusting the hem of an elderly baron's robe, when she felt a hand grip her shoulder with unexpected firmness. She looked up to find a woman she did not recognize, richly dressed, her expression sharp with an interest that made Alira instantly uneasy. "Hold still a moment," the woman said, though her attention was not on the hem at all. Her eyes had fixed instead on the exposed curve of Alira's neck, where the collar of her simple servant's dress had shifted slightly during her work, revealing more of the ink beneath than Alira usually allowed anyone to see. "What an unusual design. I do not believe I have seen its like before." Alira straightened quickly, tugging her collar back into place with practiced casualness. "An old family marking, my lady. Nothing of consequence." The woman's gaze lingered a moment too long, something calculating behind her polite smile. "Of course, though I confess I have a fondness for old symbols and their meanings. Perhaps you might allow me a closer look sometime, when your duties permit." "I would be honored, my lady, though I fear there is little to see beyond simple ink," Alira said, forcing a light, dismissive tone even as her heart pounded. The woman finally released her attention, moving on to speak with another guest, but Alira caught, from the corner of her eye, the way the woman glanced back once more, before disappearing into the crowd, her expression thoughtful in a way that felt anything but harmless. Alira finished her work as quickly as propriety allowed, and retreated to a quieter corner of the hall, her hands trembling slightly as she gathered her sewing kit. It was there that Cale found her a short while later, having noticed the brief exchange from across the room, without fully understanding what had transpired. "You seem troubled," he said quietly, keeping his voice low enough that only she could hear it over the surrounding noise. "It is nothing, Your Majesty," Alira said, though the tightness in her voice betrayed her. "Lady Perpetua does not typically concern herself with servants' garments," he said, watching her carefully. "What did she want?" Alira hesitated, weighing how much to reveal, before settling on a partial truth. "She noticed my mark, asked about its meaning. I told her it was nothing of consequence, though I do not think she believed me entirely." Something tightened in Cale's expression, a flicker of the same protective instinct that had driven him to reassign her to his personal staff in the first place, though he could not yet fully explain even to himself why the thought of Lady Perpetua's curiosity unsettled him so deeply. "Avoid her where you can," he said finally. "She is ambitious, and ambition in this court rarely serves those beneath it well." "I will be careful, Your Majesty." He studied her a moment longer, as though wanting to say something further, before simply nodding and returning to his duties as host, leaving Alira alone, with her racing thoughts and the uncomfortable certainty that whatever careful anonymity she had hoped to maintain within the castle walls had already begun to crack, one curious glance at a time. A crash of shattering glass echoed down the corridor, followed immediately by raised voices, and Alira dropped the linens she carried to rush toward the sound, before she could think better of it. In the small archive room near the castle's eastern wing, she found an elderly clerk sprawled on the floor, a broken lamp beside him, and Edwin Locke kneeling over him with obvious concern. "He fainted," Edwin explained quickly, as Alira knelt to help, checking the old man's pulse with steady hands. "Overwork, I suspect. He has been buried in these records for days at my request." Together they helped the clerk, a frail man named Garrick who had served the royal archives for decades, into a chair, and Alira fetched water while Edwin loosened the man's collar and murmured reassurances. It was only once Garrick had recovered enough to speak that Alira understood what she had stumbled into. "Forgive me," Garrick said weakly. "I have not slept properly since Lord Edwin asked me to review the old border records. Some of what is written there disturbs an old man's rest more than exhaustion ever could." Edwin's expression tightened, and he glanced briefly at Alira before seeming to decide, perhaps out of necessity given what Garrick had already revealed in her presence, that there was little point in pretending otherwise. Garrick has served long enough to remember details others have long since forgotten or been instructed to forget. "I asked him to help me understand certain inconsistencies in the official history of the Ashwood banishment." Alira's breath caught at the name, though she kept her expression carefully neutral, and Edwin, watching her closely, seemed to notice the reaction despite her efforts. He said nothing about it directly, only continued speaking to Garrick, as though testing how much the old clerk was willing to share in front of a servant girl he barely knew. "Tell her what you told me," Edwin said gently. "It may matter more than you realize." Garrick studied Alira a long moment, some old instinct for caution warring visibly with exhaustion, and perhaps relief, at finally being permitted to speak the truth aloud. "The official record states that the Ashwood pack conspired against the crown, planning rebellion, and that King Aldrich, our current king's father, ordered their banishment as a necessary act of justice. I helped file that very record myself, decades ago, though I never questioned it deeply at the time. Recently, reviewing the original correspondence at Lord Edwin's request, I found something troubling. The letters supposedly proving Ashwood's conspiracy are dated after the banishment occurred, not before. They were written to justify a decision already made, not to document evidence that led to it." "That could be clerical error," Edwin said quietly, though his tone suggested he did not believe this himself. "It could," Garrick agreed. "Except that I also found correspondence between King Aldrich and several nobles, discussing the value of Ashwood's timberlands and mineral rights, dated months before the supposed conspiracy was even reported. Whatever truly happened that night, my lord, I no longer believe it was justice punishing a betrayal. I believe it was a land seizure, dressed in the clothing of law. Elira sat very still, her hands folded tightly in her lap, absorbing the confirmation of everything Odessa had suspected, without ever having proof. She wanted desperately to ask further questions, to press for names, for details, for anything that might connect to the marks on her spine, but she forced herself to remain quiet, aware that revealing too much interest in a servant's position might raise suspicions she could not yet afford. Edwin, however, seemed to notice her restraint and studied her with new curiosity once Garrick had been helped to his quarters to rest. You grew very still at the mention of Ashwood, he observed carefully. Most servants would show only passing curiosity at old political history, if any interest at all. It is a sad story, my lord, Elira said carefully. I did not know the details before now. Edwin did not press further, though his expression remained thoughtful as she excused herself and returned to her duties, her mind racing far beyond the mundane task of folding linens. That evening, unable to settle, she found herself drawn toward the castle's eastern wing again, curiosity overriding caution in a way she rarely allowed herself. The archive room stood mostly empty at this hour, a single lamp burning low near Garrick's abandoned desk. Elira told herself she was simply returning a misplaced ledger, an excuse she had prepared in case anyone questioned her presence, but her true purpose became clear the moment she found herself standing before a locked cabinet, tucked into the room's far corner, its wood darker and older than the surrounding furniture, clearly meant to hold something the rest of the archive did not. She should have turned back. She knew, even as her fingers traced the old lock, that breaking into a restricted section of the Royal Archive was precisely the kind of attention she had spent her entire life trying to avoid. But something pulled at her, insistent and unfamiliar, and before she fully decided to act, she had already found a thin hairpin among her sewing supplies and begun working it carefully into the old lock's mechanism, a skill she had learned years earlier from a traveling tinker who had stayed briefly in Marrowfen and taught village children small tricks in exchange for supper. The lock gave with a soft click, and Elira eased the cabinet open, revealing shelves of bound records far older than anything else in the room, their leather covers cracked with age, their titles written in a hand she did not recognize. She scanned the spines quickly, heart pounding, until one title caught her attention entirely: Ashwood Territory, Genealogical Record, Pre-Banishment. With trembling hands, she pulled the volume free and opened it beneath the dim lamplight, and there, across page after careful page, she found what she had never dared hope existed. Names, dozens of them, organized into family lines and generations, the leadership structure of an entire pack, recorded in painstaking detail, by someone who had clearly cared deeply about preserving it. She recognized nothing at first glance, no name leaping out to confirm her own connection, until she reached a page near the volume's end, listing what appeared to be the pack's final leadership council before the banishment occurred. Her breath caught entirely as she read the final entries, family names paired with small notations of lineage and rank, arranged in a pattern that struck her as suddenly, dizzyingly familiar. She pulled her collar aside with unsteady fingers, comparing the shapes of certain letters in the record to the curling lines of ink she had traced along her own spine 1,000 times, without understanding them. And though she could not read her own marks directly without a mirror and better light, she recognized enough of the pattern, enough of the structure, to know with sudden, overwhelming certainty that this record and the ink on her body were describing the very same lineage. She sat frozen for a long moment, the weight of confirmation settling over her more heavily than she expected. Odessa's suspicions, her mother's desperate act, the fragments the old woman on the road had spoken of, all of it converged in this single dusty volume, hidden away in a locked cabinet that someone, somewhere, had clearly intended to keep buried. She did not know yet who among the living remembered these names, or cared whether they survived, but she understood now, beyond any doubt, that she carried something far larger than a family curiosity. She carried the last surviving thread of an entire pack's recorded history, preserved in ink upon her own skin. She was still absorbed in the volume, several pages further into the record, when the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside startled her back to awareness. She closed the book hastily, returned it to its shelf with shaking hands, and secured the cabinet's lock as best she could, before slipping out a side door moments before the footsteps reached the archive room itself. She did not know whose steps they were, only that her heart hammered the entire walk back to her quarters. Equal parts fear, at nearly being discovered, and something else entirely. A fierce, unfamiliar resolve settling into place alongside the fear. Whatever came next, whatever danger her discovery might eventually bring, Elira understood now that she could no longer simply exist quietly within these walls, waiting for the truth to find her on its own terms. She had found it herself, in the dark, in a locked cabinet no one had expected a servant girl to breach, and she intended to understand fully what it meant before she allowed fear to decide anything further for her. Unbeknownst to her, Cale had been pursuing his own quiet investigation in parallel, driven by the same restless instinct that had refused to settle since the moment he first noticed her mark in Marrowfen. He had summoned Edwin repeatedly over the preceding weeks, pressing for details on the Ashwood banishment that went beyond the sanitized account he had been taught since childhood, and Edwin, torn between loyalty to his king and the careful caution of a man who had served long enough to understand how dangerous certain truths could prove, had finally begun sharing what Garrick's research had uncovered. "The land seizure theory troubles me most," Cale admitted one evening, pacing the length of his study while Edwin reviewed a stack of old correspondence spread across the desk. "If my father ordered an entire pack, banished, perhaps destroyed, simply to claim their timber and mineral rights, then everything I have believed about the foundation of this kingdom's current prosperity rests on a lie. It would not be the first kingdom built partly on such foundations," Edwin said carefully, "nor likely the last. But I understand the weight of learning it applies to your own house specifically." Cale stopped pacing, staring at the fire without truly seeing it. "And if the seamstress is connected to Ashwood, if her mark truly represents some surviving fragment of that pack's bloodline, then my father's crime did not simply happen in some distant, resolved past. It is standing in my own household today, mending linens for a court that benefits from her people's destruction." Edwin set down the letter he had been reading and regarded his king with careful patience. "If that is true, my king, you face a choice larger than curiosity or instinct. Should this connection prove real and become known, certain members of the council, particularly those whose families profited most directly from Ashwood's seized lands, will see her not as an interesting curiosity, but as a direct threat to their current holdings. They will not hesitate to act against her, and against anyone who protects her, if they believe the truth might unravel decades of settled ownership. Then we proceed carefully," Cale said, "and quietly, until I understand fully what I am dealing with." "And if instinct alone is not enough to guide that caution?" Edwin asked, his tone gentle but pointed. "Forgive me for saying so directly, my king, but I have watched you these past weeks, and I do not believe your interest in this woman is purely a matter of political concern any longer, if it ever truly was." Cale did not answer immediately, and his silence spoke plainly enough that Edwin did not press the point further, gathering his papers instead, and taking his leave, with a final, quiet reminder that whatever path his king chose, speed and discretion would matter equally in the days ahead. Alone again, Cale remained by the fire long into the night, turning over everything he had learned: the falsified conspiracy dated after the fact, the land seizure disguised as justice, the woman whose presence in his household had unsettled him more thoroughly than any matter of state in recent memory. He did not yet know that within the castle's eastern wing, in a locked cabinet his own father had likely ordered sealed away decades earlier, Elira had already found confirmation of everything he was only beginning to suspect, standing far closer to the truth than either of them yet realized, separated by only a handful of corridors, and an ignorance that would not survive very much longer. Elira's arm gave out beneath her without warning, the heavy basket of folded linens slipping from her grip as her foot caught on an uneven floor stone in the training yard corridor. She fell hard, her shoulder striking the stone wall, and a sharp pain shot through her arm as she scrambled to gather the scattered linens, gasping against the ache. Cale, who had been crossing the yard from his morning training session, reached her before she could fully rise, kneeling beside her with immediate concern. "Are you hurt?" "Only bruised, Your Majesty," Elira managed, though the pain in her shoulder made her wince as she tried to push herself upright. Without thinking, Cale reached to steady her, his hand catching the back of her shoulder to help her rise, and in doing so, his fingers brushed against the fabric of her dress where it had shifted during her fall, pulling loose enough to expose the full length of ink running down her spine, from the base of her neck to well below her shoulder blades. He went very still, his hand freezing in place, his eyes fixed on the pattern now fully visible before him. It was not a small charm, not a simple protective symbol as she had once claimed. It was an intricate, sprawling design of names and lineage marks, curling down her spine in careful, deliberate detail, and Cale recognized, with a jolt that stole the breath from his lungs, several of the names Garrick had shown him just days earlier, in the recovered genealogical record. "Illyra," he said, his voice low and strained, "what is this?" She twisted away from him quickly, pulling her collar back into place with shaking hands, her face draining of color. "It is nothing, Your Majesty. Please, I should return to my duties." "It is not nothing," he said, rising to his feet, his expression hardening into something between shock and urgency. "I have seen those names before, Illyra. I have read them in a record my own father tried to bury. Tell me the truth. Tell me now." She stood frozen before him, torn between the years of careful hiding that had kept her alive, and the sudden, overwhelming exhaustion of maintaining a lie in front of someone who had clearly already glimpsed too much to be turned aside with easy denials. Around them, the corridor remained thankfully empty, though the risk of discovery pressed urgently against the moment. "Not here," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, not where anyone might overhear." Cale studied her a long moment, then nodded once, sharply, and led her without another word to a private study near his own quarters, a room reserved for his most sensitive discussions, dismissing the guard stationed outside with a curt gesture, before closing the door firmly behind them. Only then did he turn to face her fully, his composure fraying at its edges. "Begin at the beginning," he said. "All of it. I will know if you withhold anything from me." Illyra closed her eyes briefly, gathering the last of her resolve, and then told him everything. The infant found wrapped in a scorched blanket, Odessa's confession before her death, the letter left behind speaking of names meant to breathe again, the locked archive she had broken into, and the genealogical record confirming what she had only suspected. She spoke steadily, though her voice wavered at points, watching his face carefully for any sign of the anger or suspicion she had feared for so long. What she saw instead was something far more complicated. Cale listened without interrupting, his expression shifting through disbelief, recognition, and finally, something that looked uncomfortably close to grief. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring at the floor as though trying to reassemble a version of his own history that no longer held together. "My father ordered your people destroyed," he said finally, his voice rough. "Not for betrayal, not for any crime, but for land and mineral rights he wanted for the crown. I have suspected as much for weeks, ever since Garrick began finding inconsistencies in the old records, but suspecting it, and hearing it, confirmed by someone who survived it, someone who carries the names of the dead upon her own skin, is a different weight entirely. I did not come here seeking to burden you with your father's crimes," Illyra said quietly. "I did not even come seeking revenge. Not truly. I came because I could no longer live, not knowing what I carried, or why." "And now that you know?" Cale asked, meeting her eyes directly. "Now I do not know what comes next," she admitted. "I do not know if the crown will see me as a threat to be silenced, or simply an inconvenient reminder of an old crime best forgotten. I do not know if you, learning this, will see me the same way." Cale crossed the room slowly, stopping a careful distance from her, his expression conflicted in a way she had never seen him display before. "I do not know either, fully, what I feel, learning this. Guilt, certainly, for a crime I did not commit, but from which my throne has benefited every day since. Fury, at my father, at the council members who likely knew and said nothing. And something else, something I have felt since the moment I first saw the edge of your mark in Marrowfen, that I still do not fully understand." "What do you mean?" He hesitated, choosing his words with visible care. "There are old rights, alliance bonds recognized by instinct rather than ceremony, that some pacts once used to bind bloodlines together across generations. Edwin believes, and I have come to suspect he is right, that whatever my wolf recognized in you the day we met was not random curiosity. It was recognition of something older, some claim or connection, tied to those very names inked into your spine." Illyra absorbed this in silence, the implications settling over her slowly. "You believe I am somehow bound to your throne by an old right neither of us chose." "I believe," Cale said carefully, that whatever exists between us did not begin the day we met, however strange that sounds spoken aloud. And I believe that makes the danger you face here more complicated, not less, because if certain members of my council learn what you carry, and learn that my own instincts have already responded to it, they will see not merely a survivor to be silenced, but a legitimate claim that threatens the stability of holdings they consider settled. The weight of his words pressed down on Elira with sudden, dizzying force. She had imagined, in her worst moments during the journey to the capital, that discovery might mean exile or quiet execution, a threat easily understood if impossible to control. She had not imagined that her existence might carry legal or political weight, capable of destabilizing the very throne she had feared for so long. "What do we do?" she asked finally, her voice smaller than she wanted it to be. Kale was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a certainty that surprised them both. "We do not run from this, and we do not hide it forever, because I do not believe hiding will protect you any longer than it already has. But we also cannot act rashly, not while my father's allies still hold positions of influence within the council. For now, your safety must come first. I will ensure you remain here, under my protection, while I determine how much of the truth can be safely revealed, and when. And if your council learns before you are ready, then we face that danger together," he said simply, "rather than you facing it alone, as your mother once had to." Elira did not fully trust the ease of that promise. Not yet. Not after a lifetime spent trusting almost no one beyond Odessa's careful protection. But something in his voice, some quiet certainty beneath the political calculation, made her want, despite every instinct toward caution, to believe him. She left the study that evening with far more questions than answers, but for the first time since Odessa's death, she did not feel entirely alone in carrying them. What neither of them yet knew was that Lady Perpetua, the noblewoman who had noticed Elira's mark during the formal dinner weeks earlier, had not let the matter rest as easily as her polite smile suggested. She had spent the intervening weeks making quiet inquiries of her own, speaking with an old steward who remembered fragments of the Ashwood banishment, comparing notes with a cousin, whose family had received a generous grant of timberland in the years immediately following the Pack's destruction. Piece by piece, she had begun assembling a picture disturbingly similar to the one Kale and Elira now shared, though her interest in the truth sprang from far less generous motives. That same evening, while Kale sat troubled in his study, and Elira lay sleepless in her quarters turning over everything she had learned, Lady Perpetua received a visitor of her own, a distant relation named Baron Cassius Vane, whose family had profited more directly from the Ashwood seizure than most others in the current court. He arrived at her private chambers with the particular urgency of a man who had heard troubling rumors and wished to confirm them before they could spread further. "You believe the seamstress carries actual proof," he said without preamble, settling into a chair across from her with barely concealed tension. "Not simply an old superstition, but a genuine record of lineage. I believe it strongly enough to have spent considerable coin confirming the pattern of her mark matches descriptions of the old Ashwood genealogical seals," Lady Perpetua replied, pouring wine for them both with steady, deliberate hands. "And I believe, given how quickly our king reassigned her to his personal staff after their first meeting, that he suspects the same thing, whether or not he has confirmed it yet himself. If the girl is proven to carry legitimate claim to Ashwood's bloodline, and if that claim is ever formally recognized, it could reopen every land grant made in the years following the banishment. My family's holdings, yours, half the council's current wealth, traces directly back to lands seized that night." "Precisely," Lady Perpetua said, "which is why I believe we must act carefully, and soon, before the king decides what to do with what he suspects. Whether that means ensuring the girl's claim is quietly discredited, or ensuring she never survives long enough to press it, I have not yet decided. But I do not believe we can afford to wait passively, while a king already showing signs of unusual attachment to this woman determines our fate for us." Cassius studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "What do you propose?" "For now, only patience and careful observation," she said. "We gather more proof of her identity discreetly. We identify which other council members might share our concern once informed, and we wait for the right moment to act, whether that moment calls for exposure, negotiation, or something more permanent." She sipped her wine, her expression calm despite the weight of what she proposed. A king's instinct toward a woman is a fragile foundation for either of us to challenge directly, but a legitimate threat to dozens of noble fortunes across this kingdom is a foundation far sturdier than any single man's affections, however inconvenient those affections may prove. Neither Cale nor Elira knew, as they each retired that night, carrying the weight of a truth still fresh and unresolved between them, that a quiet conspiracy had already begun assembling itself in the shadows of the very court meant to protect them, built by people who saw in Elira's discovery not a survivor to be honored, but a debt long buried, that some among them intended to keep buried permanently, whatever the cost required to ensure it. A folded note slid beneath Elira's door in the dead of night, waking her instantly from a shallow, uneasy sleep. She rose quietly, careful not to disturb the maid sharing her small room, and unfolded the paper with trembling fingers by the light of a single candle. The message was brief, unsigned, written in a hand she did not recognize. They know what you carry. Leave before morning, or you will not have the chance to leave at all. Her blood ran cold. She had no way to verify who had sent it, whether it came from a genuine ally warning her of real danger, or from someone attempting to frighten her into a panic that would expose her further. But after weeks of carrying the weight of her discovery, of watching Lady Perpetua's calculating gaze linger a moment too long in shared corridors, of noticing whispers that seemed to trail slightly too close behind her, the warning landed with a force she could not simply dismiss. She spent the remaining hours before dawn in a state of frozen indecision, weighing the promise Cale had made against the very real possibility that his protection might not extend far enough, quickly enough, to matter if the council truly intended to act against her. In the end, exhaustion and fear won out over trust built on only a handful of shared conversations, and as the first gray light of morning touched the sky, Elira gathered her few belongings, the scorched blanket, Odessa's letter, her sewing tools, and slipped quietly from the castle through a servant's passage she had learned during her weeks of work. She made it as far as the outer market square before a familiar voice called her name, sharp with an urgency that stopped her mid-stride. She turned to find Cale himself, dressed plainly, having clearly followed her at some distance, rather than sending soldiers to intercept her directly. "Where are you going?" he demanded, closing the distance between them quickly. "Away," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "I received a warning last night. Someone knows what I carry, and I will not wait quietly in your castle to discover whether your protection is strong enough to matter when they decide to act." "Show me the warning," Cale said, and when she produced the crumpled note from her pocket, he read it quickly, his expression darkening. "This is not a threat meant to frighten you into hiding. It is a threat meant to frighten you into running, into removing yourself from my protection entirely, so that whoever sent it can act against you without my interference. How can you be certain of that? Because, if the council wished to move against you, directly within the castle, they would not need to warn you first," he said. "A quiet warning serves only one purpose, to push you into the open, alone, where protection becomes far more difficult to arrange." He studied her a long moment, something urgent and unguarded in his expression that she had not seen from him before. "Elira, please, do not let fear make this decision for you. Come back with me, and let me help you face this properly, rather than running toward a danger disguised as safety." Elira hesitated, torn between the instinct to keep running, born of a lifetime spent avoiding exactly this kind of confrontation, and the growing recognition that Cale had, in every interaction since discovering her secret, acted with more care and honesty than she had any right to expect from a king. "You cannot promise me safety," she said finally. "Not against an entire council, not against forces you have not yet fully identified." "No," he agreed. "I cannot promise that with certainty. But I can promise that I will not simply stand by and allow you to be silenced for existing, not when your existence exposes a crime my own father committed, and not when I have come to care for your safety far beyond what simple political concern would require." The admission hung between them, unplanned and unguarded, and Elira saw in his expression the same startled vulnerability she felt within herself, the recognition of something neither of them had chosen but could no longer easily deny. Truly, beyond old legends and half-remembered rites. "I do not know with certainty," Cale admitted, "but Edwin believes, and I have come to believe as well, that the old alliance rites recognized bloodlines, meant to bind two houses together across generations. A recognition instinct carries, even when memory and ceremony have long since faded. If that is true, then whatever exists between us was written into both our histories long before either of us was born, tied to your mother's bloodline, and mine, in ways neither of us chose or can simply undo. Elira absorbed this in silence, the weight of it settling alongside everything else she had learned in recent weeks. That is a great deal to accept on faith, based on instinct and old legend alone. It is, Kale agreed, and I do not ask you to accept it blindly. I ask only that you allow me the chance to prove, through action, rather than legend, that I intend to protect you honestly, whatever the rites do or do not mean for either of us. She studied him a long moment in the pale morning light, weighing his words against the fear still hammering in her chest, and finally, against every instinct honed by a lifetime of careful hiding, she nodded once, allowing him to lead her back toward the castle, rather than continuing her flight alone. It was not blind trust, not entirely, but it was a decision made with open eyes, a choice to face what came next together, rather than scattered and alone. Once safely back within the castle walls, Kale moved quickly to strengthen the arrangements around her safety, assigning a trusted guard to remain near her quarters at all times, and instructing Edwin to quietly investigate who among the household staff might have delivered the warning note, hoping to trace it back to its source before further threats could materialize. Edwin, for his part, remained troubled by the speed at which events were unfolding. "My king," he said carefully, once Elira had been settled safely, and Kale had retreated to his study to consider next steps. "I understand the urgency you feel, but I must ask you to consider carefully what comes next. If you intend to protect her openly, formally, rather than quietly, you will need to prepare for a confrontation with the council that cannot easily be undone once begun. Lady Perpetua, and those aligned with her, will not simply accept a challenge to their holdings without resistance." "I am aware," Kale said, "but I do not believe quiet protection alone will be enough, not indefinitely. If her existence is already known to at least one hostile party within the court, hiding the truth further only delays a confrontation I believe must eventually happen regardless." Edwin nodded slowly, though his expression remained grave. "Then we must prepare carefully, my king, and gather whatever proof and support we can before that confrontation arrives. Garrick's research, the genealogical record itself, and perhaps, in time, others who might have survived the banishment and could confirm what Elira alone cannot prove through her mark alone." Kale considered this, a plan beginning to form slowly in his mind, one that would require patience, careful alliance building, and a willingness to risk his own throne's stability in pursuit of a truth his father had spent decades burying. He did not yet know how difficult that path would prove, nor how quickly the council's hidden conspiracy would force his hand faster than he intended. But for the first time since learning the truth of Elira's origins, he felt something steadier than fear settling into place alongside his uncertainty, a quiet resolve to see this through, honestly, whatever the cost to the throne he had inherited under false pretenses. Edwin's investigation into the warning note yielded little in the following days, the paper untraceable, the handwriting disguised well enough that no household clerk could confidently match it to anyone on staff. Whoever had sent it had been careful, professional in a way that suggested experience rather than a single desperate impulse, and Edwin's inability to trace it only deepened his concern that the threat against Elira came from someone with resources and patience far beyond an isolated grudge. Whoever wrote this wanted her gone quietly, without violence, traceable to any single hand, Edwin explained to Kale several days later, laying the note alongside samples of handwriting gathered from various household staff without finding any clear match. "That suggests planning, my king, and planning suggests more than one person involved. I would not be surprised if Lady Perpetua's name surfaces eventually, given her earlier curiosity at the formal dinner, though I have no proof linking her directly yet." "Watch her carefully," Kale instructed, discreetly. "I do not wish to accuse a member of my own council without proof, but I also do not intend to wait passively while proof arrives on its own schedule." While Edwin continued his careful surveillance, life within the castle settled into an uneasy rhythm for Elira, days spent performing her ordinary duties beneath the added weight of knowing at least one hidden enemy watched her progress, evenings spent in increasingly frequent conversation with Kale, who found reasons, transparent though neither of them commented on it directly, to seek her out more often than his duties strictly required. One such evening, several days after her attempted flight, he found her in the small garden courtyard reserved for household staff, sitting quietly beneath the shade of an old oak tree, with Odessa's letter unfolded in her lap, reading it again, as she often did, when the weight of her circumstances grew heavy enough to require reminding herself why she had chosen this path at all. "May I sit?" Cale asked, uncharacteristically hesitant for a man used to command. Elira nodded, folding the letter carefully and tucking it away. "It is the last thing Odessa left me, a letter she wrote recording what little she knew of the night my mother brought me to her. I find myself reading it more often than I probably should, as though rereading it might reveal some detail I have missed before." "What does it say?" he asked gently. She recited the words she had long since memorized, "Keep her safe until the names can breathe again," and watched Cale's expression grow thoughtful as he absorbed them. "Your mother believed, even in her final moments of danger, that her people's names would one day be spoken again," he said quietly. "That is no small faith to carry into a night like that." "I think of her often," Elira admitted, "though I have no memory of her at all, only this letter, this blanket, and the marks she left on my skin. I wonder sometimes whether she survived that night, whether she is out there somewhere, still waiting for the names to breathe again, or whether she gave everything she had left, simply ensuring I would live long enough to carry them." Cale was quiet for a long moment, watching her with an expression that held none of the careful political calculation she had grown accustomed to seeing from him in council matters, only a raw, unguarded sympathy that made her chest ache in a way she did not fully understand. "Whatever became of her," he said finally, "I intend to make certain her faith was not misplaced. Whatever it costs me, Elira, I do not intend to let those names remain silent any longer than they already have." She looked up at him, searching his face, for the practiced reassurance of a king managing a delicate situation, and found instead something far more genuine, something that mirrored the same quiet, insistent pull she had felt within herself since the day they first met in Marrowfin's Market Square. Neither of them spoke further that evening, content simply to sit together beneath the old oak tree as the light faded slowly around them. Two people bound by history neither had chosen, drawing closer despite every danger that closeness invited. The council chamber doors burst open mid-session, and a breathless steward announced that Lady Perpetua had called an emergency gathering, one that could not wait for the scheduled meeting 3 days hence. Cale, seated at the head of the long table, felt a cold certainty settle over him even before she entered, flanked by Baron Cassius Vane and 2 other nobles whose family fortunes traced back directly to the Ashwood seizure. "Forgive the interruption, Your Majesty," Lady Perpetua said, her tone smooth and formal, despite the tension radiating from her posture. "But I have learned something that I believe cannot wait for the ordinary business of this council to address it." "Speak plainly," Cale said, keeping his own expression carefully composed, despite the dread coiling in his chest. "I have reason to believe," she continued, "that a servant, currently employed within your personal household, carries physical proof of surviving lineage from the Ashwood pack, the very pack your father banished decades ago, for conspiracy against the crown. I have consulted with several of my colleagues, and we believe this matter demands immediate and thorough investigation, given the implications such a claim could carry for land grants and titles settled in the years since that banishment." A murmur rippled through the assembled council members, some clearly hearing the accusation for the first time, others exchanging glances that suggested prior knowledge or at least suspicion. Cale allowed the silence to stretch a moment before responding, weighing carefully how much to reveal, given that Edwin's investigation had not yet uncovered sufficient proof to move directly against Lady Perpetua herself. "You speak of serious matters, based on what evidence precisely?" he asked. "A mark observed upon her skin, matching descriptions of the old Ashwood genealogical seals recorded in surviving fragments of pre-banishment documentation," Lady Perpetua replied. "I do not make such claims lightly, Your Majesty, nor without considerable research to support them." Cale understood, in that moment, that further denial would only appear evasive, and that the wiser course lay in controlling the narrative, rather than attempting to suppress it entirely. "I am aware of the woman you speak of," he said, watching several council members stiffen at the admission. "I have known of her mark for some weeks now, and I have been conducting my own careful investigation into its origins and significance, before bringing the matter before this council." "And did you intend to inform us at all?" Baron Cassius interjected sharply. Or did you plan to manage this matter privately, perhaps to your own benefit, while the rest of us remained ignorant of a claim that could unravel landholdings across half this kingdom? I intended to establish facts before presenting speculation as certainty, Cale replied, his voice hardening. Something this council might have benefited from as well, rather than arriving here with accusations built upon a servant's overheard conversation and second-hand research. The exchange grew tense, voices rising as various council members staked out positions, some aligning immediately with Lady Perpetua's evident alarm, others more cautious, recognizing that whatever truth existed here carried implications too significant to dismiss outright, but too uncertain to act upon rashly. Edwin, seated quietly near Cale's side, watched the room carefully, noting which faces showed genuine surprise and which betrayed prior knowledge through their studied calm. I propose, Lady Perpetua said, once the initial uproar had settled slightly, that the woman be brought before this council for formal questioning, and that her claim, whatever its true nature, be resolved definitively, rather than left to linger as a private matter within the king's own household. Cale felt the trap in her proposal immediately, bringing Alira before a hostile council, many of whose members stood to lose considerably should her claim prove legitimate, offered her no genuine chance at fair hearing, only exposure to those most motivated to see her silenced. I will not subject a household servant to public interrogation before this council, based on unverified claims, he said firmly. If genuine evidence exists, connecting her to Ashwood's surviving bloodline, it will be examined properly, through careful and impartial investigation, not through a hastily convened tribunal, driven by concerns over land holdings. With respect, Your Majesty, said Lord Alden, an older council member who had remained largely silent until now, his tone measured rather than hostile. If such a claim proves true, it touches matters of succession and legitimacy that extend beyond any single household's private concerns. The stability of this kingdom's settled land grants rests, in part, on the assumption that the Ashwood banishment was final and its claims extinguished. Should that assumption prove false, this council has a legitimate interest in understanding the implications, however uncomfortable the process of discovery may prove. Cale recognized the fairness in Lord Alden's words, even as he resisted the pressure building around him, understanding that outright refusal risked appearing as though he had something to hide, while capitulation risked exposing Alira to exactly the danger he had promised to protect her from. I will conduct a formal investigation, he said finally, with appropriate oversight from this council, to ensure impartiality, but I will not surrender a vulnerable woman to hostile interrogation before facts have been properly established. Edwin Locke will lead this investigation, alongside representatives chosen by the council, and findings will be presented to this full body once evidence has been thoroughly examined. The compromise satisfied no one completely, though it was accepted, grudgingly, by enough of the council to avoid immediate crisis. Lady Perpetua's expression remained tight, with barely concealed frustration, as the session finally dissolved, and Cale caught her exchanging a brief, meaningful glance with Baron Cassius before they departed together, confirming his suspicion that their alliance extended well beyond simple concern for the kingdom's stability. That evening, Cale found Alira in her quarters, her expression already tense from having heard, through the castle's ever-present network of servant gossip, that her existence had been formally raised before the council. They know, she said, before he could speak. Truly know now, not simply suspect. They do, Cale admitted, and I have managed to secure a formal investigation, rather than immediate hostile interrogation, but I will not pretend the danger has passed. Lady Perpetua and those aligned with her will not rest until this matter is resolved in their favor, one way or another. What happens if the investigation confirms what we already know to be true? Cale was quiet a moment, weighing his answer carefully. Then this kingdom faces a reckoning it has avoided for decades, and I intend to ensure that reckoning favors truth and restoration, rather than further concealment, whatever the political cost to my own throne. He studied her carefully, seeing the fear beneath her composed exterior. I will not let them silence you, Alira. Whatever it requires of me, I intend to see this through honestly, as I promised. She wanted desperately to believe him fully, without reservation, but the weight of the council's hostility pressed too heavily against easy comfort. And if honesty costs you your throne, then it costs me my throne, he said simply. Rather than costing you your life, or the memory of an entire pack, its final chance to be remembered honestly. The certainty in his voice, unwavering despite the very real danger it invited, settled something uneasy in her chest. Not complete reassurance, but a foundation sturdy enough to stand upon, while the coming storm gathered around them both. 2 days into the formal investigation, as Edwin worked carefully alongside 2 council-appointed observers to review Garrick's genealogical findings, Alira encountered Lady Perpetua directly, for the first time since the council session, crossing paths in a quiet corridor near the castle's private chapel. The noblewoman stopped, studying Alira with an expression that held none of the polite curiosity she had displayed at the formal dinner months earlier, only cold, calculating appraisal. "You have caused considerable disruption for a simple seamstress," Lady Perpetua said, her voice pitched low enough that no passing servant might overhear. "I did not seek disruption, my lady," Alira replied, keeping her own voice steady, despite the unease coiling in her stomach. "I sought only to understand my own history, which I did not choose, and cannot undo." "Perhaps not," Lady Perpetua allowed, "but history has a way of demanding payment from those who disturb it, regardless of intention. My family, and many others in this court, built our current standing upon settlements made in good faith decades ago. Should your claim prove legitimate, you would ask us to surrender that standing, our lands, our titles, built across generations, simply because the manner of their original acquisition proves uncomfortable upon closer examination." "I have asked for nothing," Alira said. "I have not petitioned this council for land, or titles, or restoration of any kind. I have only tried to survive long enough to understand what was done to my people, and why." Lady Perpetua's expression flickered, something almost like genuine consideration crossing her features before hardening again into cold resolve. "Intentions matter little once truth becomes public knowledge, child. Whether you seek restoration or not, others will seek it on your behalf once your claim is confirmed, and the consequences will unfold regardless of what you personally desire. I would advise you, for your own safety, to consider carefully whether the truth you seek is truly worth the storm it will unleash upon you. Is that advice, my lady, or a threat?" "It is simply reality," Lady Perpetua said, delivered plainly, "since I suspect our king has not been entirely forthcoming about the true scope of danger you face. There are members of this council who would see you removed permanently, rather than risk their families' fortunes to a legal claim, decades in the making. I am not among the most extreme of them, but I would be lying if I claimed to oppose their concerns entirely." She departed without waiting for a response, leaving Alira standing alone in the quiet corridor, her heart pounding with a fear that felt different from the vague, unformed dread she had carried since childhood. This was no longer an abstract danger, some shadowy soldier who might one day knock upon a distant door. This was a concrete, named threat, delivered directly and without pretense, and it left her shaken, in a way that took considerable effort to hide when she returned to her duties that afternoon. She reported the exchange to Cale that evening, watching his expression darken with barely controlled anger as she recounted Lady Perpetua's words. "She threatens you directly now, without even the courtesy of subtlety," he said, pacing the length of his study. "This confirms what Edwin suspected, that she coordinates with others who would prefer you silenced entirely, rather than risk a legal confirmation of your claim." "She did not threaten violence directly," Alira said, though her voice wavered slightly. "Only warned me of what others might do." "A warning delivered with full knowledge of what it implies is not meaningfully different from a threat," Cale said grimly. "I will have additional guards assigned to your quarters immediately, and I will not permit you to move through this castle without escort until this matter reaches its conclusion." He stopped pacing, turning to face her directly, his expression softening slightly despite the tension still evident in his shoulders. "I am sorry, Alira. I brought you further into this danger by bringing you into my household, however much I believed at the time that I was protecting you rather than endangering you further." "You did not create this danger," she said quietly. "Your father did, decades ago, and those who profited from his crime have simply chosen now to defend what they gained by it. I do not blame you for their choices." He studied her a long moment, something raw and unguarded passing across his features. "Regardless of blame, I intend to ensure their choices do not determine your fate. Edwin's investigation is nearly complete, and once it confirms what we already know to be true, I intend to bring the full truth before the council myself. rather than allowing Lady Perpetua and her allies to control how and when that truth becomes public. It is a risk, but I believe it is safer than allowing them to continue circling in the shadows, gathering support for whatever action they ultimately intend to take against you. Elira nodded, though the fear Lady Perpetua's words had planted did not fully leave her that night, or in the tense days that followed, as Edwin's investigation moved steadily toward its conclusion, each day bringing them closer to a confrontation neither Cale nor his enemies could much longer avoid. A fist slammed against the council chamber table hard enough to rattle the inkwells, and Baron Cassius rose to his feet, his face flushed with fury, as Edwin finished presenting the completed findings of his investigation. "This is fabrication," Cassius shouted. "Manufactured to serve the king's own attachment to this woman, nothing more." "The correspondence dates speak for themselves, my lord," Edwin replied evenly, unshaken by the outburst. "The letters accusing Ashwood of conspiracy are dated weeks after the banishment occurred, not before. The land grant agreements discussing timber and mineral rights predate the supposed conspiracy by several months. These are not my conclusions alone, but the documented findings of Garrick, a clerk who has served this archive faithfully for decades and who has no reason to fabricate evidence against the crown he has served his entire life." Cale, seated at the head of the table, allowed the tension to build a moment longer before speaking. "I called this session not to defend my own conduct, but to present the full truth this council deserves, however uncomfortable that truth may prove for some among you. My father ordered the Ashwood Pact destroyed, not for genuine betrayal, but to seize valuable land and resources, under the cover of manufactured justice. The woman currently in my household, Elira, carries physical proof of that pact's surviving lineage, inked into her skin, by a mother who gave everything to ensure some record of her people would survive that night." He gestured, and Elira stepped forward from where she had been waiting quietly near the chamber's entrance, dressed simply, but with a composure she had not felt within herself only weeks earlier. At Cale's nod, she turned and allowed her collar to be lowered enough that the full extent of the ink along her spine became visible to the assembled council, a hush falling over the chamber as several members leaned forward, comparing what they saw against copies of the genealogical record Edwin had distributed earlier in the session. "The pattern matches," Lord Alden said quietly, studying the comparison with evident discomfort. "I have reviewed enough old Ashwood correspondence in my youth to recognize the structure of their family seals, and this matches precisely." Murmurs spread through the chamber, some council members exchanging alarmed glances, others sitting in stunned silence, as decades of settled assumption began visibly crumbling before them. Lady Perpetua, seated near Cassius, kept her expression carefully neutral, though Cale noted the tightness around her eyes that suggested calculation, rather than genuine surprise. "Even if the mark proves genuine," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs with practiced authority, "what precisely does this council intend to do with such information? Reopening decades of settled land grants would throw this kingdom into chaos, destabilizing fortunes and holdings that countless families have built their lives around in good faith. Good faith built upon a lie remains built upon a lie," Cale said, regardless of how many years have passed since it was told. "I do not propose immediate, chaotic reversal of every grant made since the banishment. I propose instead a formal acknowledgement of the truth, restoration of the Ashwood name and remaining territories that remain unclaimed by current grant holders, and recognition of Elira's rightful place as heir to that restored lineage. Where legitimate conflict exists between current holdings and rightful restoration, this council will negotiate fair resolution rather than wholesale seizure." The debate that followed stretched long into the evening, voices rising and falling as council members argued positions shaped by self-interest, genuine moral concern, or some uneasy combination of both. Lord Alden, to Cale's quiet relief, proved a steady voice for reasoned compromise, while Lady Perpetua and Cassius fought bitterly against any restoration that touched their own family's holdings, though their position weakened visibly as more moderate council members, confronted with clear documented evidence, grew unwilling to defend an obvious historical injustice simply to protect entrenched interests. What none of them expected was the news that arrived just as the session seemed poised to conclude without full resolution, a breathless messenger entering the chamber to announce that a small group of travelers had arrived at the castle gates, requesting audience with the king regarding, as they had phrased it to the confused gate guards, the return of Ashwood's name. Cale called for the group to be admitted immediately, and the council chamber fell into stunned silence as 5 travelers entered, weathered by long journeys, but standing with a quiet dignity that spoke of survival hard won. Their leader, a man named Rowan, who appeared to be some years older than Illyra, stepped forward and, without prompting, pulled back his own collar to reveal a similar pattern of ink marking his shoulder, smaller and less extensive than Illyra's, but unmistakably related in design. "Word travels slowly among those of us who scattered that night," Rowan said, his voice rough with emotion he made no effort to hide. "But word does travel, eventually, among survivors who have spent years hiding in villages across this kingdom, each of us carrying some fragment of what remained. When we heard rumors that a woman bearing the full genealogical mark had been discovered within the royal household itself, several of us decided the risk of coming forward was finally worth taking." Behind him, the other travelers, a woman named Cassia who carried a young daughter on her hip, an older man named Nolan who walked with the careful stiffness of old injuries never fully healed, and 2 others, who introduced themselves more quietly, all bore some mark of connection to the Ashwood lineage, whether through similar ink, old family heirlooms bearing the pack's symbols, or simply the accumulated testimony of relatives who had survived the fire and passed down fragments of memory across the years since. The chamber, which moments earlier had been locked in bitter debate over abstract questions of legal precedent and land grants, fell into a different kind of silence entirely, the weight of living, breathing survivors standing before them, shifting the argument from theoretical inconvenience to undeniable human reality. Even Lady Perpetua, Cale noted, seemed momentarily at a loss, her carefully constructed arguments about chaos and instability, suddenly confronted with the simple, unavoidable fact that an entire community of people had survived decades in hiding, waiting for exactly this moment to finally come forward. "How many of you are there?" Cale asked quietly, "scattered across this kingdom?" "More than we know for certain," Rowan admitted. "We have found each other slowly over the years, through careful, cautious inquiry, never gathering in large numbers for fear of drawing attention that might finish what the fire began. But I believe, should safety finally be assured, many more would come forward than currently stand before you." Illyra, watching these strangers who shared her blood, though she had never met any of them before this moment, felt something break open in her chest, grief and relief, and a fierce, unfamiliar joy, tangled together almost too tightly to separate. She was not, as she had believed for her entire life, the last remaining fragment of a destroyed people. She was simply the most visible survivor of a community that had endured, quietly and painfully, waiting for the day their names could finally breathe again, exactly as her mother had hoped. The council session concluded that evening, without final resolution on every detail, but with something far more significant achieved, an undeniable acknowledgement before the full body of Thornhale's ruling class that Ashwood had survived, that its people lived still, scattered but enduring, and that whatever settlement the crown ultimately reached, it would need to reckon honestly with a living community, rather than a conveniently erased memory. Lady Perpetua and Cassius withdrew from the chamber that night, with expressions that promised further resistance in the days ahead, but even they seemed to understand that the tide within the council had shifted in ways their earlier maneuvering had not adequately prepared them to counter. Later that evening, once the chamber had emptied and the formal weight of council business had lifted, Illyra found herself seated in a quiet antechamber with Rowan, Cassia, and the others, sharing food brought quietly by castle staff, and more importantly, sharing stories neither side had ever expected to hear spoken aloud by someone who understood their true weight. Rowan told her of his own escape that night, a boy of perhaps 12, carried on his father's shoulders through smoke thick enough to blind, separated from his family in the chaos, and raised afterward by a distant cousin, who had sworn him to silence about his true origins. "I remember almost nothing clearly," he admitted, turning his cup slowly between his hands. "Only fire, and shouting, and my father's voice telling me to run and not look back, no matter what I heard behind me. I did not understand until I was much older what exactly we had lost that night, or how deliberately it had been taken from us." Cassia, bouncing her young daughter gently on her knee, shared a similar story, though hers involved a mother who had survived the fire itself, only to succumb to illness years later, leaving Cassia to piece together her heritage from fragments of stories told during quiet evenings before her mother's death. "I named my daughter Ashen," she said quietly, "so that even if I never learned the full truth of what we lost, some small piece of memory would carry forward in her name." Elira listened to each story with a growing sense of connection she had never expected to feel, the isolation that had defined her entire life, slowly giving way to something warmer, more communal, a recognition that her survival was not an isolated miracle, but part of a larger, quieter endurance that had continued in the shadows for 18 years, without her ever knowing it existed. She shared, in turn, Odessa's story, her mother's final words recorded in that brief, precious letter, and the marks upon her own spine that had brought them all finally together in this castle antechamber. "Your mother's sacrifice reached further than she likely ever dared hope," Nolan said quietly, his weathered face solemn with emotion. Whatever became of her that night, she ensured that her people's names would not simply vanish. She ensured, instead, that they would eventually call each other home. The warmth of that evening, however, did not extend to every corner of the castle. In a private chamber elsewhere within Thornhale's walls, Lady Perpetua and Baron Cassius met once more, their earlier confidence considerably shaken by the sudden arrival of living survivors before the full council. "We cannot allow this restoration to proceed unchecked," Cassius said, pacing with barely restrained agitation. "If the king moves to formally recognize Ashwood's claims, our family holdings become vulnerable to challenge, regardless of how carefully any settlement is negotiated." "I am aware of the stakes," Lady Perpetua said coldly, "which is why I have already taken steps you are not yet aware of. I have sent word to my cousin who commands a small garrison along the northern border, requesting he delay any formal notice of Ashwood's restoration from reaching the wider kingdom, until we have had opportunity to negotiate more favorable terms privately with the king, terms that protect our holdings regardless of what public acknowledgement ultimately occurs." "And if the king refuses such private negotiation?" Lady Perpetua's expression hardened further. "Then we will need to consider whether his growing attachment to this girl has clouded his judgment badly enough to warrant a formal challenge to his fitness to rule. A challenge this council retains the ancient right to raise, should sufficient support be gathered among its members." She paused, studying Cassius carefully. "I do not say this lightly, nor do I relish the prospect of such conflict, but I will not stand by and watch decades of settled family fortune dismantled, simply because our king has fallen for a servant girl carrying convenient tattoos." Neither of them yet knew that Edwin, ever cautious and thorough in his service to the crown, had already anticipated exactly this kind of resistance, and had quietly begun gathering support among the council's more moderate members, ensuring that whatever challenge Lady Perpetua eventually attempted would find far less fertile ground than she currently believed possible. The following days would prove decisive, not through violence or open conflict, but through the slower, more grinding battle of political will, evidence, and the simple, undeniable weight of survivors who refused any longer to remain silent. A formal challenge to Cale's fitness to rule was announced before the full council on a cold morning, barely a week after Ashwood's survivors had first come forward, Lady Perpetua rising to deliver the accusation with practiced composure, despite the murmurs of surprise rippling through the chamber. She accused the king of allowing personal attachment to compromise his judgment on matters of state, of pursuing restoration policies that threatened the kingdom's stability without proper council deliberation, and of favoring a household servant's claims over the settled interests of noble families who had served the crown faithfully for generations. Cale listened to the accusation without visible alarm, having anticipated, through Edwin's careful groundwork over the preceding days, that some such challenge was likely to emerge. When Lady Perpetua finished, he rose to address the chamber directly, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "I do not deny that my judgment in this matter is shaped by more than political calculation alone," he said. "I have come to care for Elira deeply, not despite the truth she carries, but in part because of the courage it took her to seek that truth, despite every danger it invited. But I would ask this council to consider whether restoring an unjustly destroyed pack's name and rightful lineage constitutes poor judgment, or whether it constitutes, finally, the honest governance this crown has owed its people since the night my father chose land and profit over justice." He gestured, and Edwin stepped forward to present, methodically and without embellishment, the full weight of evidence gathered over recent weeks. The falsified conspiracy letters dated after the banishment, the land grant correspondence predating any supposed rebellion, and testimony gathered discreetly from Rowan and the other survivors, confirming details of that terrible night that matched precisely with the documented record, rather than the official story taught for decades since. Lord Alden, when called upon to speak, offered testimony that proved decisive in shifting the chamber's mood further still. "I served under King Aldrich in my younger years," he said quietly, "and I confess, to my own shame, that I harbored quiet suspicions about the Ashwood matter, even then. Suspicions I did not have the courage to voice at the time. I will not compound that old cowardice now by remaining silent while evidence this clear stands before us. I support restoration, and I support our King's judgment in pursuing it, however personally motivated that pursuit may also be." Other council members, moved by Lord Alden's admission and the accumulated weight of evidence, testimony, and living survivors that had gathered over recent days, began withdrawing their support from Lady Perpetua's challenge one by one, until it became clear even to her that the vote, should it proceed to formal tally, would fail decisively. Baron Cassius, recognizing the shifting tide, quietly distanced himself from the accusation entirely, leaving Lady Perpetua to face the chamber's judgment largely alone. "I withdraw the challenge," she said finally, her voice tight with barely concealed frustration, "though I maintain my concerns regarding the practical implementation of any restoration policy that touches settled landholdings." "Your concerns will be heard and addressed through fair negotiation," Cale said, extending a diplomatic courtesy she had not necessarily earned, but that served the kingdom's stability better than open enmity. "I do not intend restoration to proceed through chaos or seizure, but through careful, considered process that respects both historical justice and present-day realities." The formal challenge collapsed within the hour, and in the days that followed, Cale moved swiftly to formalize what the council session had already begun. He issued a royal decree restoring the Ashwood name officially to the kingdom's records, acknowledging the injustice of its banishment, and establishing a process through which surviving members of the pack could reclaim unclaimed territories and negotiate fair settlement where current land grants conflicted with restoration. Rowan, Cassia, Nolan, and the others who had come forward were granted formal recognition as founding members of the restored community, tasked with helping locate and welcome the many other scattered survivors who would surely emerge now that safety had finally been assured. Elira herself was named, through careful legal process that drew upon both restored Ashwood tradition and the ancient alliance rights Edwin had first mentioned weeks earlier, as rightful heir to the Ashwood lineage, a recognition that carried with it both symbolic weight and practical authority over the community's restoration. And in a ceremony that combined old Ashwood custom with the formal rites of Thornhale's throne, conducted before the assembled court and the growing number of Ashwood survivors, who had begun arriving from villages across the kingdom, Cale formally acknowledged what his wolf had recognized from their very first meeting in Marrowfen's Market Square, naming Elira not only as Ashwood's rightful heir, but as his intended queen, bound to him through rights older than either of their individual histories, chosen freely now by both of them, despite everything that had once stood between them. The ceremony itself was simple, compared to the grand formality Cale's advisors had initially proposed, held in the same garden courtyard, where Elira had once sat reading Odessa's letter, beneath the shade of an old oak tree, attended by the survivors who had become, in the span of a few short weeks, something like family to her. Rowan stood witness alongside Edwin. Cassia's young daughter scattered petals along the garden path, and even Garrick, recovered fully from his earlier collapse, attended with visible pride at having helped uncover the truth that made this day possible. As the ceremony concluded, and the assembled crowd offered their blessing, Elira stood before them with her collar deliberately lowered, the full length of ink along her spine visible to anyone who cared to look, no longer a secret to be hidden or feared, but a record to be honored openly. Cale took her hand before the gathered witnesses, and together they addressed the survivors who had traveled far to witness this restoration, promising not simply symbolic recognition, but genuine partnership in rebuilding what had been lost, land returned where possible, resources committed to those still struggling after decades of hiding, and formal protection under the Crown's law for any Ashwood descendant who wished to step forward and claim their heritage openly at last. In the months that followed, More survivors emerged steadily from villages across the kingdom, drawn by news of the restoration, spreading slowly but surely along trade routes and traveling merchants' tales. Some arrived cautious and hesitant, still carrying the fear ingrained by decades of necessary silence, while others arrived with quiet joy, finally able to speak their true family names aloud, without fear of consequence. Elira met each of them personally where she could, listening to their stories, comparing fragments of memory and lineage, slowly piecing together a fuller picture of the community that had once thrived along the northern border, before fire and greed had tried, and ultimately failed, to erase it entirely. Odessa's grave, back in the quiet village of Marrowfen, received a proper headstone that spring, paid for and commissioned by Elira herself, honoring the woman who had kept her safe through 18 years of careful hiding, without ever asking for recognition or reward. Elira visited at once, before the demands of her new position made frequent travel difficult, kneeling by the simple stone to speak quietly of everything that had happened since Odessa's passing, the truth uncovered, the survivors found, the names finally given voice after decades of enforced silence. Standing later that same day, at the edge of the old Ashwood forest, now reopened to its rightful people after decades of restriction, Elira felt the weight of her mother's final act settle fully into place at last, understood completely, for the first time since Odessa had first shared the fragments of that terrible night so many months earlier. Her mother had given everything, a name, a history, a bloodline entrusted to a stranger's care, betting everything on the faint hope that one day, somehow, the names inked into her daughter's skin might finally be allowed to breathe again. They had, not through violence or vengeance, but through patient truth, careful courage, and the unexpected, undeniable bond between a hidden heir and a king willing to risk his own throne to make right what his father had wrongfully destroyed. Ashwood's legacy, carried silently for 18 years across the spine of a woman who had once believed herself entirely alone in the world, now lived openly once more, spoken freely, honored fully, and finally, after so long in hiding, allowed to breathe. Cale joined her at the forest's edge that evening, having ridden out quietly with a small escort once he learned where she had gone, finding her standing among the first new growth pushing up through soil that had lain untouched and forbidden for nearly 2 decades. He did not speak immediately, simply stood beside her, watching the last light of the day filter through branches that were slowly, steadily reclaiming what fire had once taken. "It is strange," Elira said finally, "to stand here now, knowing this ground once belonged to my mother, to people whose names I still do not fully know despite everything we have uncovered these past months. I expected, when I first learned the truth, that finding this place would feel like an ending. Instead, it feels more like a beginning I am only just learning how to walk into." "Perhaps that is fitting," Cale said quietly. "Endings suggest something finished, closed, settled beyond further change. What is happening here feels far from settled, and I do not think it should be, not yet. There are still survivors we have not found, still land to properly restore, still families like Lady Perpetua's who will need patient negotiation rather than simple decree before old wounds truly begin to heal." Elira turned to look at him, the man who had risked his own throne rather than allow her existence to be quietly erased a second time, who had chosen honesty over the comfortable silence his father's crimes had afforded him for decades. "You did not have to risk so much," she said. "You could have quietly protected me without ever bringing the full truth before your council. No one beyond a handful of people would have known the difference." "I would have known," Cale said simply. "And I do not believe a crown built on continued silence, even a comfortable, well-intentioned silence, is a crown worth keeping. My father chose profit over truth once, and an entire pack paid the price of that choice for 18 years in hiding. I did not wish to inherit his mistake quietly and pass it forward unresolved to whatever comes after me." They stood together a while longer, as the sun finished setting behind the restored tree line, the forest around them quiet, except for the distant sound of survivors' voices, carried faintly on the evening air from the small camp Rowan and the others had established nearby, while more permanent homes were rebuilt. Elira thought of Odessa, of the scorched blanket still folded carefully among her belongings, of the mother she would never know, but whose final act of desperate hope had led, after everything, to exactly this moment, standing at the edge of a forest finally returned to its rightful people. "Thank you," she said quietly, for believing an old letter and a stranger's tattoos were worth risking everything you had built. Cale took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, with a gentleness that belied the considerable power he still held as king. "Thank you," he replied, "for trusting a throne that had given you every reason not to, and for teaching me, in the process, what this crown was always meant to protect, rather than simply what it was convenient to ignore." They walked back together toward the small camp, as full darkness settled over the newly reclaimed forest, joining Rowan and Cassia, and the others gathered around a modest fire, sharing food and stories late into the night, voices rising in old songs half remembered from childhood, fragments of a culture slowly stitching itself back together, one survivor, one memory, one reclaimed name at a time. Somewhere beneath the ink on Alira's spine, names that had waited 18 years in silence finally found their voices spoken aloud, around a fire in the very forest they had once called home, carried forward, not as a burden any longer, but as a legacy finally, fully, undeniably alive.